Hello, welcome. Today we're going to be doing an economy upgrade of an old Dell Optiplex desktop computer. Upgrading it not with the latest, but with older, more affordable equipment, which will give it more computing power without being too costly. Okay, so we're starting with an old Dell Optiplex desktop. So the first thing we do is we're going to open it up and essentially remove everything that's inside of it. So let's get started. You're not going to be able to remove the motherboard without first removing the power supply. You notice here that the power supply is not simply falling out of there. Okay, that's because there's a clip holding it in. Before we pull that clip, we want to disconnect the power supply from the motherboard. That's going to be these two connectors right here, right there, and this one over here, that little yellow and black one right there, pops right out. Now the power supply is ready to come out, and there's a little clip that you can see. It's actually behind this. You see it right here. If I push on that clip, the power supply is going to drop out of there. Now we can proceed to start disconnecting everything else. First, let's pull all the rest of the cables, starting with here. I already took the hard drives out, so here's the power for the hard drives coming out of this plug right here. So we're just going to pull that one out. So here's our CPU, our cooling tower fan right here, and it's got a little tab that you just pull on the bottom and it pops out. So that's this little tab right here, which you can see. All right, and then here is the chassis fan in the back. So there's that one right there, same kind of plug. This right here is our chassis intrusion detector. This is the thing that will give you a little warning in your BIOS if you have it turned on, if somebody's opened up the case. Now the next thing that we're going to want to do, because it's kind of hard to get to these other plugs, is we're going to pull out this GPU right here. So in order to do that, I'm just going to push this little tab on this side, and that pops down, and then this guy will pop right out. So that's it for the GPU. All right, so here are our other connectors over here. So let's start with, here's your USB 3. Has a little tab right there. Just push on that guy and pull him out. And this one is your USB and front panel audio connector. This has clips on either side, so just push in on those guys. This is the thermal sensor, which is connected to the case here. That just pulls out. And then here's your speaker connector. This thermal sensor we're not going to use, so we're just going to pull that out of the case altogether. The cooling tower we're going to reuse. The fan inside the chassis we're going to reuse, although we're going to have to do some special modifications. Okay, the last connector to come out is the power connector right here. He just pulls out. He's a little sticky, but he just pulls out. Okay, so now the motherboard is ready to pop out of there. So let's go ahead and get that done. Just going to gently pull the motherboard up, angle it over and out. Okay, so here is our old motherboard, and this isn't going to be useful to me, but I do want to reuse this cooling tower. So Okay, so there's the cooling tower. Now, I've already scraped off the thermal paste that was on here. What I generally do is I scrape it off with a razor blade and then use a little bit of isopropyl alcohol to clean off anything that's left. There we go. Now this thing is ready for reuse. All right, this new motherboard is a Gigabyte B360M DS3H. It is about 7 years old. It is a socket 1151 motherboard and supports 8th generation Intel processors. This is an economy rebuild, and I'm going to reuse as much of the old machine as I possibly can. In this case, what that means is the cooling tower. Now, before we can install the cooling tower, we have to do a couple of things. The first of which is we're going to have to modify the power connector. These Dell motherboards had some custom connectors for their I/O headers, and this is one of them. So the fan connectors are 5-pin connectors, and the ones on our motherboard here are the standard 4-pin connectors. In addition to that, you can see here on this yellow wire here is pin 1 on the motherboard. Pin 1 is on the right. So when we try to plug this in, if the pin connections are correct, we can use the 5-pin connector only using 4 pins. But that tab here is going to run into this tab right here and put pressure on the motherboard connection, and we don't want to do that. So 2 things we have to do. One is we have to swap the wires around, because on the Dell, the yellow wire is pin 1, black wire is pin 3. On the standard motherboard connector, the 4-pin connector, those 2 pins are reversed. In addition, in order to make this thing fit without putting pressure on the motherboard, we're actually going to have to reverse all the pins so that the black is pin 4, whereas it normally would be pin 1. And then that way, this connector will drop right in there without putting any pressure on the motherboard. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. We're going to swap those pins around. Okay, so that's a little bit more difficult than I thought that was going to be. And we've now swapped those out. So that if looked at this way, you can see that the black, which is actually pin 1 on this motherboard, is now in pin 4. And the blue, which is pin 4, is now in pin 1. So when we mount this in the motherboard, we will simply take this connector and then it will hang off the right side, and then now our connections are correct. The next thing that we have to do is mount the cooling tower onto the motherboard, and we have to install the chip before we can do that. I just want to mention that this is really, really important to be very, very careful before you put in the chip, because these pins are very, very delicate. My last motherboard, I had some accidents and I bent a couple of pins and spent quite a bit of time with some tweezers and some sewing needles to straighten them out before I finally got them fixed. So you want to be careful about that. So we're going to close this up. On the old motherboard, you had this bracket, and those 4 screws went into that bracket from the other side. So this motherboard here, we're going to put in this bracket right here, and that goes just like that. We'll do that like this. So that is now where we're going to be able to mount this just like that. But before we do that, we're going to have to install the chip. So in this one, we're putting in an i5-8500T, which is an 8th generation Intel processor. All right, so now our chip is installed. And we'll put a little dab of thermal paste right there. Okay, you don't want to do too much because you don't want it to spread too far. I'll make a comment here about thermal paste. This particular one is some Corsair TM30, supposed to be performance paste. You know, whatever thermal paste you have, in my opinion, is going to work fine. All right, so now we're going to take our cooling tower and we're going to mount it right there like this. Now it's going to kind of float on top of the chip. We want to be real careful about that, about moving this around. And screw it down just a little bit at a time. Okay, now we have it in there. We connect up our fan. Hopefully, if we did all that right, then this will work. So we're putting in 64 gigs of memory into this machine. Okay, so one other thing we're going to put in this HP M2 SSD card. That's going to give us an extra 1 terabyte drive in the machine we can use for caching and temporary storage. Okay, so before we move on from here, we would like to know if all of this is going to work. So the best way to find that out is to plug in a power supply, hook it up to a monitor, and we'll find out if this thing is actually working so that we know if we have to fix anything before we try mounting this in the case. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. Okay, it's coming on, our fan is working, and we are booted into the BIOS. Everything's working, so we're good to go. We have a few more modifications to do to the case. Okay, here we are back looking at the case, and I've gone ahead and put the front cover back on just so we can show what we're going to be using here now. Here's the power button for this case. This power button has an LED in it so that when the power is on, that LED is lit. This front panel has the high definition audio and 2 USB 3 and 2 USB 2 ports on it. The USB 3 can be used directly, but the USB 2 ports and the high definition audio go into this one connector, which is custom for the Dell motherboard, but will not work in the new motherboard, which uses 2 9-pin connectors. I did actually think about trying to reuse this. The problem is twofold. One, it means I would have had to have gone out and buy a kit which would allow me to rewire these conductors into 2 9-pin connectors. And the second problem was, I don't know if you can see this or not, but this USB plug right here is damaged. And it simply was cheaper and easier not to use these. And I'm going to replace that with this guy right here, which is going to give me all the same features. And that was cheap. Okay, so in looking inside here, obviously we are going to be using this chassis fan. This chassis fan connector has the same issue as the CPU fan connector, so I made the same modifications to it. I swapped the black and yellow pins and then reversed them all so that they can fit nicely into the motherboard without putting any pressure on it. I also went out on eBay and found another chassis fan from an Olde Optiplex case like this one, because this box doesn't come with an intake fan in the front. So I'm going to try to mount this one in here like this. Now I needed an extension cable to connect this fan to the 4-pin connection in the motherboard, which required a 4-pin extension cable. But it's something of a brain fart. I ended up getting a 4-pin to 5-pin adapter cable that would have allowed me to move the Optiplex motherboard into a modern case with 4-pin fan connections. So I rewired this connector, and then I shaved off the unused pin to make it so that it would fit in here like that. And then this one has been rewired so that it plugs into the motherboard just like the other chassis fan. So I've already tested it, and that's working great. Then we have this speaker right here. I'm actually not going to use that. This has a 5-pin connector on it. I'm going to throw in one of these guys right here. I bought, like, I don't know, 10 of them for like $10 a while back. So, right, this is the chassis intrusion detector, right? This plug right here. And there is a chassis intrusion circuit on this motherboard, but I don't particularly care about it, so I'm not going to be using that guy. Now I am going to use the power switch. Here's the power button, and it comes out of there pretty easily. Two little clips, top and bottom, and then it's hung up in here on these wire clips. So you just gotta reach up in there and undo it from the clips, and it'll pull right out the front here. All right, because we're going to have to do some modifications to this cable. There are 5 conductors in this cable. The yellow and black are for the power switch, which will be wired into a single 2-pin connector. The blue and orange are the power LED. We're going to wire that into another connector, and then we'll plug them into the motherboard so that when the power goes on, the power LED will light up. The red conductor can be ignored. It's part of the diagnostics of the Optiplex motherboard, which doesn't apply here, so we're just going to ignore that one. So I'm going to go ahead and go make that modification right now. Finish the modifications to the case. I've gone ahead and mounted that additional fan. We're going to use that as an intake fan. I didn't have any sort of standoffs that I could use, or at least couldn't figure any out, so I just used some wire ties there. Now, I did rewire the power button. I'm actually not going to use the LED that's inside the power button. I decided instead to drill out the audio and then put power LED and a hard drive LED there. So now we're ready to put in the motherboard and the new power supply and try firing it up. So let's do that. So now it's time to fill our 5 1/4 inch drive base here. This is going to be 2 rated SSDs. Okay, these are cheap. These are 64 gigabyte, cost me $15 a piece. Here's a 5 1/4 to 3.5 adapter. And here are 3.5 adapter that let me mount two 2.5-inch drives in each one of them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, and mount 2 of these and install them in here. Once I'm done with that, then I'm going to install this, my replacement for my USB connections and my front panel audio. This is a Chinese product. All right, and I think I got this for something like $16, $17. One thing I would show on this one, it's got a power connector here. Seems to indicate that it wants power, but there's nothing in any documentation that I can find, including the documentation on this device says no external power is required, and I don't see why this would need power. It should all come off the motherboard. So we're going to plug it in without power, and we'll see if it identifies our USB drives, and then we'll know. We'll plug in power if we need to. So I've gone ahead and built my drive enclosure with my two 64 gigabyte SSDs. It's going to be the boot volume. So I'm ready to install both of these. Now on this Dell Optiplex, this cover side here is the only thing that opens up. The other side is riveted in. So the way you mount this is here's a track here, and you slide these in that track, and this locks it in. Okay, I'm back. Now, I went ahead and tested everything that we've installed so far, so I know that the USB drives didn't need a power connection, even though there's one on that board in this enclosure here. So I'm installing a couple of 500 gigabyte SATA drives that I happen to have in my bag of tricks. These slide in pretty easily, but there is a caveat you need to worry about. Here's where they get mounted. They have these little pins right here. All you do is you line those up on those pins, and then you have to bend this part back. And you want to do that carefully because that will snap. Right, and then they just slide in pretty easily like this. But as you can see, the clearance you're going to get when you put the side cover on here, you can see how close this is. There isn't any room for large connectors. So if you're going to use this big 3.5-inch technology on the drives, then you're going to have to use these angled connectors. Not only that, but when you plug in the power connectors, you see how this one has the wire coming out the back. That actually won't clear the cover. So you want to use these angled power connectors here. All right, so let's fire it up. See if it recognizes everything. Okay, so we're into the BIOS. Let's go over and check and see if our drives are in. Yep, see the M2 SSD that's on the motherboard. We see the two 64 gigabyte SSDs that are in that second 5.25 bay. And then here's our two 500 gigabyte drives. So now that we have that, let's see if we can boot into some installation media. So there you have it. This new server is ready to use, and everything works as expected. So that's how you can upgrade an Optiplex 9020 if you really want to. But sadly, this experiment is a failure because economically it doesn't make any sense. The motherboard, processor, power supply, memory, and the SSDs I would have had to purchase anyway. But for the money I spent to make this case work, I could have simply bought a mid-tower ATX case from Amazon and saved some money. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. This is my first, and I welcome all critiques. Be kind if you can, but flame if you must. Promise to do better and maybe even produce something useful next time. So long for now. Hope to see you again.